Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Dancing into Brain Health podcast. I am your host, Magda Kaczmarska. Creativity is one of the most universal human capacities, something that connects us to meaning, expression, and to one another. From a neuroscientific perspective, it is also deeply complex, engaging multiple regions of the brain in ways that we're still only beginning to understand. In this episode of the Dancing into Brain Health podcast, I'm joined by renowned behavioral neurologist, Dr. Bruce Miller, and actor and writer, Jake Broder, for a conversation centered on the remarkable story of Anne Adams, whose artistic emergence while living with frontotemporal dementia transformed how we think about creativity in the brain. Together, we explore how moving beyond a deficit-based narrative of dementia opens space for new understanding, revealing creativity as something that can persist, transform, and even flourish in the face of profound change. Dr. Bruce L. Miller is the A.W. and Mary Margaret Clausen Distinguished Professor of Neurology and Director of the UCSF Edward and Pearl Fine Memory and Aging Center. An expert in neurodegenerative diseases, he focuses on frontotemporal dementia and Alzheimer's disease. Jake Broder is a playwright, actor, screenwriter, and musician, and his play Unraveled was commissioned following his tenure as an Atlantic Fellow for Equity at Brain Health at the Global Brain Health Institute at UCSF and premiered in the United States at the Wallace Annenberg Center for the Performing Arts in October 2025. Welcome, Dr. Miller. Welcome, Jake. I am so honored to speak with you today. Thank you for making time to connect.
We're honored to be with you, Magda. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you. So this is the moment where listeners will know I get really gushy. This is the moment you might get uncomfortable, Dr. Miller and Jake, but we're going to spend most of this conversation speaking about the work that you do. And both of you have, in your unique ways, really astute and caring lens that you apply and kind of shine onto the stories of others. I want to start by holding space for your stories and maybe a little bit of the background of what brought you to the conversation that we're going to be having today. Now, if I may, I'd love to start with Dr. Miller, or as he's asked me to call him Bruce. So I will do that. It is really an honor to speak with you. Those who are listening may be aware of your life's work and the impact that you have made on the field of neurodegenerative conditions, especially frontotemporal dementia. Really, your impact is unparalleled. But aside from your achievements in clinical and research spaces, you're also a very passionate champion of the arts, and as well as the capacity and the importance of the arts in our lives and telling stories that can help shape how we think about and talk about dementia. You direct one of the premier institutions that helps really on every level folks who are walking this path of dementia. And you helped found the Global Brain Health Institute, which is now taking that conversation to a global sphere and really exponentially increasing the opportunity for impact. And through all of this, as I think both Jake and I can attest, you are one of the most generous mentors that exists on the planet. And there really aren't enough words to express the impact that you've already made and that you continue to make. So I just want to start by saying thank you. And if you'll please allow, I know you're not one that's comfortable with this, but please allow this moment of gushing and celebration of who you are and all that you do.
I would maybe phrase it a little differently. And I had you, Magda, and Jake as people I've been able to work with and touch in some way. And of course, you've touched me in so many ways, shows what a lucky person I've been. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I wonder if we could start with your journey. I'm curious, what inspired you to pursue a career in behavioral neurology and that led you to do the work that you do today?
For me, as I move closer and closer to neurology, I realize that the parts of the brain that make us so uniquely human, the brain, it is what makes the study of frontotemporal dementia-related diseases so exciting. And so very early on, I realized that neuroatypical, different ways of behaving, different ways of seeing the world really came down to the way the brain was organized. And I think being able to probe that in a specialty, behavioral neurology, it was just so exciting for me. And each individual person I got to see where there was a change in behavior, change in cognition, suddenly began an opportunity to understand how the brain worked and also go backwards and think about how I could help that person.
Yeah, and I can attest to witnessing that, but also know that there are people who to this day, when they hear your name, they light up because
Mm.
of the impact you have made. Probably some of the most difficult moments in their life. It takes a really, really, caring person to hold space for people and help them navigate that journey.
One thing that I learned from Oliver Sacks was that, uh, if we're really gonna help people, we really have to understand who they are.
Mm,
If we're gonna be effective, we have to connect. If we don't
mhm.
connect, then all of our fancy theories and medications we might, think about won't ever get there. So I think that connection with people is so much part of the craft that I work in and such an important part of what I do every day.
Yeah, and being able to hone that and support other people in developing that craft.
Yes.
Jake, if I may, I'd love to turn the lens to you. Bruce connected us initially when I was completing my fellowship at GBHI, and Unraveled, which I briefly mentioned and we'll talk about much more, was just starting. We've had an opportunity now to connect on a few very deep and lengthy conversations. I will say that, and I say this with absolute adoration that you are probably the only person like you that I know. I am endlessly fascinated with the way that you perceive and see and notice the world and people's stories and the connections that you make. They're completely unique. And every conversation that we have, I feel that it could be an entire book or play or a film series. But I'm also in awe of how you manage to balance it all. I had to work really hard to try to create a short bio for our introduction, but in the show notes, folks, you'll be able to read just some of the things that Jake has done in his career. But you seem to just keep on expanding this repertoire of artistic practice. And in recent years, you've stepped into a whole new hat of being an allyship with people who are working in the fields of brain health and dementia, but also who are navigating the journey of experiencing and dementia either as a individual or a care partner. So it's really humbling to speak with you. I'd love to start um, kind of unpacking a little bit from your perspective, what drew you to this work? Before you came into working in neuroscience and brain health and the field of dementia and advocacy, education, and research, you had already had an extensive career as an actor, a writer, and director on some of the most prestigious stages and venues. What sparked your interest in this field? What drew you to brain health and dementia? And if it feels appropriate, I'd love to hear how your two paths cross, but we can also follow up with that.
Okay. Well, listening to your answer, Bruce, I realize the idea of things that make us human, I didn't know at the time it was certain parts of our brain that did that. But my preoccupation has always been with that part of us. And I approached it through storytelling and
Mm.
approached it through narrative rather than through scientific inquiry. But I feel like I'm curious about the same things. And then the idea of fostering connection, which is the whole the art of that, and the purpose of a lot of drama is to create connection
Mm,
between an audience and the storyteller, and also between the people who are telling the story. That is the engine that makes everything move. And then the idea of working backwards is that a lot of times I find myself thinking about how do I want something to impact an audience? And then I work backwards to create that impact. I work backwards all the time. Looking at people through the lens of behavioral neurology, you can
mm,
see really clearly how, and not in a mechanistic way, but the causality of why things happen the way they do. And that's the engine of story. And to go to how this all connected up is my whole story starts with fear and
mm,
terror. Is that my dad had something, we didn't know what it was. I was terrified. And I realized later most people never leave that space.
mm,
But while we were in that place of not knowing, but knowing something was happening and he wasn't diagnosed yet, I was listening to Radio Lab, which is a really wonderful radio program. And they did a show called Unravelling Bolero. And I was sitting in my car and I had one of those really typical driveway moments where I couldn't get out of the car until it was over. And it was the story of Ann Adams and Ravel and how they were connected. And Bruce, you were interviewed on that and were telling the story, contextualizing it. And they explained how Anne painted Ravel's Bolero and they both had FTD. And for a moment, I had this feeling of hope wash over me that was stronger than the fear I felt about my own dad. And I think the idea that there is a condition where creativity can blossom in the early phases before other things take over. I never heard of such a thing. I couldn't conceive. It gave me hope. It made me think, well,
Mm,
neurodegeneration is not just a one-way ticket down. It's a transformational ticket that goes in a lot of directions. And
mm,
that gave me hope. And so then, because my job is taking what I feel and projecting it onto other people, I decided that I wanted to tell this story and share that feeling of hope as much as I could.
mm,
And part of the research, digging into it, all roads led to you, Bruce. And so I think after I researched as much as I could, I think I wrote you a fan letter and said, I'd really love to chat with you about this, or I'm really interested in this. And can I ask you questions? And to my delight and surprise, you wrote me back and was like, are you Jake from Silicon Valley? And I was like, yes. And we struck up a conversation, which began with this book that's on my shelf, Genomics, Circuits, and Pathways in Clinical Neuropsychology. And so I
sounds like a
sat,
doozy.
it was, it took me 3 months with a magnifying glass and a highlighter to read it. And once I did, I came back and said, okay, I looked at the first thing and now I have a whole bunch more questions. And then you said, come on up and be the Hellman visiting artist for a year. And I just sort of dove in. And it was a brilliant invitation, sparked by curiosity, but completely embraced, that I just dove and was given unbelievable resources and support to be able to follow this path as deep as it could lead.
And hearing Jake describe his reaction, I mean, the reactions that I've gotten to this story are quite varied, but some other reactions initially, and even now as well, this isn't very interesting or it isn't real. But for Jake to see the grandeur of it and to think as time went on about the artist itself from the inside, what she experienced, and then what Ravel experienced as he wrote one of the greatest pieces of music, I think, ever written. But I'm not a musical critic, but I think it has had such a sustaining influence on music and our culture in so many ways. But for Jake to think about that person with this illness, what it was like to live inside her, how her incredible partner, Robert, who we're still friends with, reacted to this changing person. I mean, that's vision. That's something different. Nobody other than Jake ever reacted in that way.
The practice that I think I learned at the MAC and at the GBHI, and really from you, was how to lead with empathy in the work and how to bring that into practice, not just being nice to people when you meet them, but empathy and being able to listen and hear. Understanding someone's experience allows anyone to contemplate it and synthesize and draw conclusions or imagine or whatever. But it starts from a profound place of centering empathy in the practice day to day in the work. And that for me was new. I'll admit it. I didn't understand the value of it until I saw it, until you modeled it. And then I just copied it and repeated until something happened.
I mean, you're speaking about empathy, but so we're kind of going into a gamut of emotions. But Jake, you mentioned something that kind of percolated for me. You mentioned your own story within your family and the experience of unknowing and the fear that came up. Thank you for sharing that. I think many people can relate to that. And I think that fear can manifest itself in many different ways. One of our guests last season was Dr. Francesca Farina, who has studied in some of her work fear and how it leads to aversion when we're talking about dementia. And the antidote to it is to actually create opportunities for learning, for conversation, for community, to kind of guide people into really looking at the thing and seeing all of its shapes and also the container of it, right? Fear helps to grow something kind of without end versus being able to look at it and notice it. And so what I'm hearing from you is not only did this learning about Dr. Bruce and Adam's story opened that set of parameter for you. But it also, you being the incredible person that you are, you actually helped create a work of art that is now doing that for other people. And in so doing, modeling ways of being in relationship that come from Robert and Anne that we have already introduced briefly.
There's a larger conversation which comes out of this. Think of it as like a pink ribbon moment. Dementia is something which the rising tide of it is actually an example of our success as a species in a lot of ways, because we're outliving our brains for the first time in human history. And so we reckoned with the heart a century ago. And now it's time to reckon with this. It's the frontier. It's what we need to do. But it unites everybody, past class, past race, past everything. It's just everybody has a brain, or so they would have us believe. And, so it's this great unifier. And the idea that we all live in fear about dementia or neurodegeneration, that I think about like cancer. When I was growing up, people would say, cancer, and they'd whisper it into corners. And it was this fearful thing that you couldn't say. But now people say, well, I'm fighting a battle with cancer and winning, or fighting a battle with cancer and losing. And because the world has changed its way of dealing with it, partially because of treatments and partially because of medicine, but also because of the culture. In 1992, I think it was Self magazine of all places, put out a pink ribbon to fight breast cancer. Everybody rallied around that like crazy. And that was the beginning, I think, of the change in language and the change in how society said, you know what? We're not saying cancer isn't terrible. We're not saying cancer isn't horrible, but it's something that we can face together. Let's take it out of the closet. Let's look at it really, really. And now our language is different about it. It doesn't have that kind of stigma anymore that it used to. And I feel like we are at a similar place with the brain. We're ready. The world is ready to lose the shackles of fear and step into something more understanding based and hope filled and more dynamic. Not bright siding, but saying this is a 360 issue that we can all deal with. I hope that by the time I go or my kids grow up, that nobody would ever say, God, if I have Alzheimer's, just take me in the back and shoot me. I hope we can get past that by positively evidencing the things that are still possible by people with conditions and, frankly, some of the extraordinary things that are possible only because of it. Say Bolero, regardless of how you feel about that piece of music, it is incontrovertible. It's one of the most frequently played pieces in the canon all over the world. Even now, it's 100 years later, I think almost to the day. So it's been around and it's had a huge cultural impact. And this is a piece that was created not in spite of, but because of a diagnosis. So if that's possible, then what else is possible?
Jake touched on something about outliving our brain, which I think is really so fundamental as a concept. We're one of the few species where we have grandparents that are involved with nurturance of the next generation. For many species, it's be born, procreate, and die. We even have genes. My friend at San Diego, Pascal Gagno, has written about this. He calls them grandmother genes. And these are genes that evolved as our species evolved, as we became more social and more connected, that protect the aging brain. So we converted from a protein called ApoE4 to a protein called ApoE3, which is much less likely to lead to Alzheimer's disease. So there was some evolutionary value in elders and keeping elders around so that they can offer many things that we all hope to give grandchildren. So I think Jake touches on something really important there about the importance of elders with or without beginnings of a neurodegenerative disease.
Altruism, was it
Yes.
called? Yeah.
There's also the concept of generativity that I learned from my colleagues at Generations United, who really promote intergenerational collaborations and grandfamilies, grandparents raising grandchildren. And that was music to my ears, Bruce. I would love to see that study because, as you all know, I've dedicated my life to working with elders. It's the thing that gets me out of bed every day. I'm delighted to hear that there's a genetic rationale for this love.
And you're the reason they get out of bed in the morning.
It's mutual. And it's not just me. There's a growing community. It's wonderful. I think it goes both ways. Well, we could go off on the tangent, but there is research that people who are raised by their grandparents end up being much more attuned and comfortable with being with their elders. So it kind of goes both ways. Before we go into a deeper dive into Anne Adams' story and then Unraveled, the work that you have grown and built and is now continuing to grow, Jake. I wonder if many of our listeners, and as we know, quite a lot of people in our society still are fairly unaware of what frontotemporal dementia is. And maybe they have heard about it, but we have the unique opportunity to speak with one of the people who has put frontotemporal dementia on the map. And this helped really shine a light and pave a very wide road for others to continue to help support these communities and the individuals who are walking with frontotemporal dementia. Bruce, can you speak a little bit about what FTD is and how does it differ from other forms of dementia?
Yeah, so the frontotemporal dementia has proven to be, I think, a little bit elusive for our society. It's not something that was easily understood either by the neurology or psychiatry community. So badly neglected, badly ignored. When I was growing up, the term for frontotemporal dementia was Pick's disease. People very confidently said, don't pick Pick's disease. Too rare, undiagnosable, trivial, and of course, could not have been more off. It's a disease that affects unique parts of the brain that I like to call social brain. Parts of the brain that allow us to connect with others, empathize with others, regulate our behavior so that others like us and admire us. And as I describe this, you can imagine when someone develops frontotemporal dementia, these key human features, social regulation, kindness, caring about others, these are things that diminish or disappear almost immediately. So this is not the way our society's thought about people. We have tended to think that when those things are wrong, it's the fault of the person. It's some sort of a character deficit of some kind or it's a psychological process. It was hard for people to grapple with the idea that when you have these behavioral changes, which happen with the behavioral variant of frontotemporal dementia, that this is a degenerative disease, very similar to Alzheimer's. The only difference is it's a different part of the brain and it involves different proteins and genes. So we developed research criteria for this illness, and they're unlike any criteria I've ever seen. They include disinhibition, loss of empathy, apathy, overeating, repetitive compulsive behaviors, loss of executive function. All of these changes are driven by loss of these components in the front part of the brain. We now know there are genes that predispose to this, although many cases are not genetic. We now know head trauma is a risk factor, but it's still relatively mysterious, yet I think with the genetic forms, advances in research are making it very likely that very soon we will have powerful therapies to treat, even prevent this condition.
Thank you for illuminating this. And Jake, I know that you're recently starting to walk into this path of connecting with folks who are living with frontotemporal dementia as well as care partners who are navigating this journey alongside them. What are you learning about some of the unique challenges that people with FTD face? And maybe this is a question for both of you. Obviously, you are navigating this in different spheres, so you might notice things obviously differently.
Well, when you were describing FTD, I was thinking about looking at neurodegeneration through the lens of neurodevelopment. And I've spent a lot of my life, both myself and with my children and with other people, working on ADD and AD, which is a frontal lobe condition. And I've often thought that there are some similar traits, I think, in those conditions. One perhaps is on the way up in life, and the other is maybe on the way down, but the mechanism sometimes feels similar, the behavior sometimes feels similar. And so I think I have great sympathy or empathy for that kind of thinking, and I can see how it tracks in a person. And that feels important. Sometimes, I mean, it's a terrible joke, but I've joked like 'cause sometimes I feel like I can rent it, but give
Mm.
it back for a little bit. But it also, it's hard to unsee that once you
Mm.
have, or unfeel it once you have. So that's a part of it. And then your question, Magda, about working with the community, I have found that telling a story where there is a heroic act by both Anne in her painting and Ravel in her painting and in Robert with his caregiving,
Mm.
showing three different modes of heroism that can exist inside a story like this allows for people who witness it or engage with it to see
Mm.
themselves inside it a little bit. And the feedback that people take away, or I've heard, has been like, oh, that happened to me. I feel like that.
Yeah.
So there's sort of transference there, and I think that's a good thing. I guess I've discovered a little bit that creating a story, telling a story, creating entertainment that's for a general audience gets people quite excited about something, but then creates space, creates a very activated group of, 500 or 1,000 people who are like, what do I do with all this energy? And then we create this outreach program that surrounds the show that helps them direct that energy to information, to community groups, to workshops, to different kinds of outputs that help. As an artist, your job is to stir people up, but then not to preach to them or tell them what to do, but to awaken their curiosity or fascinate them or emotionally connect. And then what you can do with an audience who feels that way is pretty immense.
Jake continues to surprise me in such a wonderful way. And there's never been a playwright who I think has so creatively and directly thought about how to translate to the broader community, and including people who are suffering with this condition outside of the play. So he designed an unbelievably ambitious set of initiatives around Unraveled when it was shown, including Magda. Bringing dance to people who are worried about degenerative diseases. And we know it's good for the brain. And education modules that were in the lobby, actually showing the art of Anne. I think this for me was a paradigm shift, a very ambitious idea that we're not just going to stop with the play and wait for it to filter into society. We're going to change society today with the play, the minute it is over. And I think, how do you measure this? How do you quantify it? I'm not sure, but I know this is really important.
Well, we're doing a lot of metrics with audience stuff, and we're almost done with our report about, people who came to your workshop, Magda, the engagement levels of what they felt about things when they walked in the door and then what they felt when they walked out. We have those metrics, and they're, especially your class, I mean, off the chart, crazy. And it was amazing. And you just think, well, okay, people need a place to go. And so we can find one. And I've learned that there's an incredible ecosystem. It's kind of disorganized, but there's an unbelievable ecosystem of support that already exists. I'm not making it up. It already is there. I mean, we're aggregating it and focusing it like a lens a little bit, but there's so much goodwill and energy and people who want to do this kind of stuff, giving people a place to land to say, hey, share your work with others who need it. And people who need it, come and find people who are already doing this output. Come together. It's like everything's so siloed. Art is a place, it's a good excuse to bring people together. And we call it a brain health festival so that it doesn't sound scary. But it kind of is, because there's there's art and there's books, because it's not just one quadrant of society that needs to be able to talk about this. People who appreciate art are going to come in one door. People who need caregiving support are going to come through another door. People who want to read your book, Bruce, Mysteries of the Social Brain, are going to come in through another door. There's so much that exists that being able to sort of put it all under one roof and have it feel like a good time gets the conversation started.
Well, it comes back to what has started to emerge as a theme for our conversation is that sense of connection on multiple levels. Right? What I'm learning is that we're actually engaging with you on stage when you're on stage. So there's that level of connection, but there's also the thematic connection that you're providing, but the connection that you're inspired to and you're seeking, and then you have a community where you can immediately engage, or at least take an idea when it's been kind of stimulated and digest it and engage with it later. I really appreciate you saying also this kind of entering into community, observing that there are multiple paths already. If you've ever witnessed somebody weaving, it's just a ton of different disparate strings that kind of get opened and closed, and then you add more strings into it. And then what you have is this really sturdy piece of fabric. So we need many opportunities for people to make those connections for those strings. And you are definitely both creating a platform for it, but also doing the weaving. So I appreciate you for doing it.
Well, it's hopeful. There are a lot of strings already. We're not in a desert with nobody. There's so many people who care about this,
Yeah.
who are itching.
So I'm kind of torn. I think maybe we can go into this next question, kind of addressing it from multiple perspectives, because you've already started to introduce the story of Anne Adams and Unraveled. And I wonder if we can jump into her story. Obviously, we want people to come see the play, so we won't give all of it away. But can you maybe tell us a little bit about her story? And also, what's really cool is that Dr. Miller, you were her doctor at one point, and Jake, you're telling her story. So you each bring a beautiful perspective. Can you share a little bit, maybe, Bruce, how you first learned and met Doctor, because she's also a doctor, and
So a friend of mine who I helped to train, Dean Foti, went back from UCLA where I was to Vancouver, and occasionally he would send a patient my way that was complicated. He knew I was interested in visual creativity and art in the brain, and he had seen this professor who had lost language. It's a form of frontotemporal dementia called progressive non-fluent aphasia. Asked us to look at Anne. And Anne and her family and her husband, what an unbelievably strong, connected unit, as
Mm,
I've learned from Jake and the family over the years. They came down and were extraordinarily generous with information. Robert was a mathematical professor at UBC, a brilliant man and a great observer.
mm,
And so we studied the language problem, but came back to, what turned out to be some of the most remarkable art I had ever seen. And Jake will talk a little bit about the painting that Anne made that connected her to Ravel called Unraveling Bolero. And that was the peak, we think, of her artistic productivity, but it went on into the latest stages of her illness when she was already having motor trouble with her right.
mm,
Um, and so it was at a time when we were starting to stop talking about brain areas and we're beginning to talk about circuits.
mm,
And Bill Seeley, who worked with me, was probably the most brilliant person in the world in understanding circuits. And to put it simply, he discovered that Anne, very early in the course of her illness, was downregulating the language circuit and the left frontal lobe, but upregulating the visual, allowed her to think about things in a visual way and produce eventually magnificent paintings that evolved as her illness evolved.
So you
I mean,
actually addressed a question that I was going to ask you. Sorry, Jake, I interrupted you. You mentioned how working with Anne helped really shift that paradigm. You used that word earlier in our conversation to shift the paradigm of not just looking at a neurodegenerative condition from the loss or the degeneration, the deficit, but recognizing that there's actually a connection, that there's an emergent growth. Dr. Seeley, I think he used the words enhancement and liberation. I needed to use those because they're so powerful. Liberation is a powerful word. That there's a liberation in a different part of the brain, even as a part of the brain is in deficit. And that can you explain that? Is this because there's a circuit that is causing this?
yeah, I mean, the old notion is that if we're really smart, we use all of our brain at once and we could just get more neurons working at the same time, we'd be smarter. It really don't work that way. And this whole field of understanding the circuits in the brain says Well, if we're going to use one circuit really effectively, we better turn off a lot of competing circuits. So if Magda Kazmierska is going to do a unbelievable dance, which I've seen her do, she probably does not want her language circuit wide open at the same time. And I think that's really the story of our human diversity. Some of us have stronger circuits and part of the brain and turn off other circuits a lot of the time. And that's what happened to Anne. Her left frontal circuit for language was diminishing. And as Bill said, as you said, it liberated the back of the brain, that it allowed a visual person already to be wickedly, brilliantly visual.
Well, she had this amazing cognitive reserve. Her background artistically was as a draftsman. She painted these botanicals. She was a very highly skilled draftsman. She had good drawing skills. And then her scientific rigor probably gave her a lot of executive function to burn. But if language as a circuit is dominant and probably inhibitory, if you think about it like a city traffic, that language is this boulevard going right down the middle, and it has all the green lights, which means all the cross streets are red. That when language becomes less dominant, you have green lights on the cross streets. The thing is that this isn't just about things going badly. When you think about flow state, when an artist is in a flow state, it's not necessarily a language dominant place. There's a balance between visual and musical and other senses, different kinds of processing happening, so that in a way, she passed through, I think, a phase of a profound flow state by having the language forcibly turned down. And so the mice play while the cat's away, but it sort of allowed the other circuits to go and created a different balance in her than is perhaps normal. But then it sort of argues the point, well, is normal good? Is perhaps the place she got to, which allowed her to paint things like Unraveling Bolero, but then she did it with Pi, then she did Migraine, get to that in a sec. But, she was able to do some extraordinary things because the language was turned down, which meant the other stuff was turned up. E.g., we fill the space with something, and if something goes away, something else can come in. I don't mean that to sound woo-woo, but just the physics of that are kind of really encouraging, because some of the best work, artistically speaking, comes from that place. And so Anne obsessively listened to Ravel's Bolero and then translated it measure by measure into this painting, which 314 cells in a zigzag pattern. And it almost looks like music, but it has 3 dimensions and many colors. And it not only has the information on it with the paint, she also did a whole nother layer of embossing on top of that. So it actually, the painting has an X, a Y, and a Z axis. It's pretty extraordinary. But then she moved on and did this transmodal work, where then she did a painting called Pi, which was pi up to, it was 1,440 places. And around it are throughout thousands of years of history, all the formulae that have come through many cultures and societies about this sort of mystical number and what it means. And so she was able to contextualize both the beauty and the wonder of this concept in a painting. And then she did something called Migraine, which was something she suffered from, but she was able to paint the experience. Like, it was almost synesthesia, taking pain and turning it into a visual form, and on and on and on. She kept developing. And what was amazing about her work was that as her condition developed, certain circuits were dominant, and then it changed and other circuits were dominant. Her obsessions changed, and you could track, like, then she went into a whole phase where she all of a sudden really popped into photorealism. And she started being obsessed with radial symmetry. It was like things were getting burned away, and then what was revealed was what she was obsessed with creatively, which shows a hierarchy.
Yeah.
And so that was mind-blowing about the nature of creativity and how all of us perhaps are stacked up.
I think we've left lots of little seeds for folks, and I hope that they're hungry to engage with Unraveled. I had the privilege of seeing the premiere in Beverly Hills on October 2025. I'm curious, Jake, what's on the horizon for Unraveled? What's next?
Well,
and how can our listeners get involved?
Pretty easily. So what's next is we're essentially taking Unraveled on tour, at first around the US, and then we're looking at some international partners. every place we go, we have a neuroscience partner, a medical partner, an advocacy partner, and a theatrical partner. And so we're building a consortium of partnership in different cities. Right now, we're going to be rehearsing in June. We're doing some fundraisers in May. We have another rehearsal in September. And then we open our first engagement is in Philadelphia in concert with Penn and the ICFTD conference, the AFTD, and Penn Live Arts Stroke
Mm.
Opera Philadelphia. And we'll be performing there for a week at the beginning of October. And then we also just booked New York City. We'll be at the Miller Theater, and our partners there are the Zuckerman Institute at Columbia and Mount Sinai, as well as the Dana Foundation and again the AFTD for advocacy work. And there's about 7 or 8 other places that are on the boil. And then we'll have more to announce soon. But you can go to a website, which is unraveledplay.com. That's unraveled with 2 L's, because we spell it the British way, because I don't know. That's how we do it. And that's what we're doing. So yeah, unraveledplay.com is where to find us. And you can reach out and we will reach back. Yeah, there's lots of opportunities to engage in the work, to come and see the show. The Brain Health Festival has a lot of places for people who are in any part of this ecosystem to come and engage, both with resources and in conversation. And we are excited to hear from you.
It's fantastic. So it's really coming up this year. So thank you. This is timely that we're talking now. And unraveledplay.com is in the show notes, as well as some other resources about folks who are interested in reading about some of the research that has grown out of Anne's story.
Yeah, that paper with Bruce and Bill and
Adit?
Brandy Matthews is the 2008 Brain. I think it enhanced creativity in the posterior neocortex is one of the best papers I've ever read. It just blew my face off. It's such a good read.
Well, if for those who are listening who haven't read an academic paper yet, then this is the one to try.
It has awesome pictures and it's not scary.
It's got awesome pictures. It's not scary, but also it will maybe add some additional language to some of the things you've heard today. And I know in our work, and actually one of our other guests on the show is a person who is living with dementia, who since his diagnosis has flourished in photography and writing poetry. He has in fact just published his first collection of poetry.
Hey!
Mark Timmons. So if you want to check out his podcast. So a different type of creativity, but creativity nonetheless. I just want to ask if there's any other final thoughts that you want to share, Jake.
I do have
Okay.
one last thought, is that it has been a huge pleasure to work on this with you for a while. The amount of joy, generosity, and expansiveness you bring to all of the stuff you do. One of the workshops that we did, you were instrumental in shaping and doing. We had sort of caregiver dyads, and there was a big constituency of people that yours was the favorite class by far. People wanted to really engage with what you were doing, and it's been such a pleasure.
Jake, thank you. Well, thank you for creating a platform for it. And I'm humbled, and I also am delighted to hear that this initiative that you've nurtured and cultivated with a growing team of people is going to continue to grow, because I also know that there are many wonderful artists and communities who think will want to be a part of helping this project grow and reach more voices.
Yeah, and hopefully when we go to Philadelphia and New York, you'll be able to join us to do more workshops with people.
Oh, that's a given, my friend. If you
We'll
do
keep
not
you
call
busy.
me up, I'll be
Okay.
calling you up.
Okay.
No, there's
Okay.
lots of communities. We've been talking about Bolero. We've been talking about Unraveled. We've been talking about Ann Adams. There's so many people here in the communities that we've been working with in New York that cannot wait. So I can't wait to get on a phone call with you and plan that. And help connect you with some other folks. We always ask our guests to share a personal experience. We started with a personal gushing, and I want to finish with coming back to your individual stories. So I want to know if there's an experience either that you've personally experienced or that you've witnessed where you felt the magic of either dance or other arts on health and well-being.
Well, I'm going to tell a Magda story because it is one of the most impressive events I ever went to. So we had a special event at the community center, and south of Market, and some very fragile elders, many of them very isolated and alone for months. I think only Magda could do this. Magda worked through Zoom and many other ways with a large group of these individuals to prepare their own presentation. And at that event, suddenly you had these quiet, fragile, isolated, vulnerable elders walking the walk, singing beautiful songs, dancing. And if you don't believe in the power of music or dance to transform elders, all you had to do was watch that one event. It was one of the most beautiful evenings I have ever spent, and I still have embedded in my brain each and every one of those presentations. It was so otherworldly and so elegant and beautiful. Thank
That's
you.
the typical Bruce answer, shining the light. But thank you. And I want to shout out to the Mission Neighborhood Center and Community Center and the Creative Minds program that helped make that possible. It's like many beautiful things. It's a team. Um,
And Jake was there. He can
that's
verify.
right.
Attest to the truth.
Jake, did you have one that you want to share?
My story is about a judge in San Francisco. I found this out, I think, earlier this year. So there was a judge who came to the MAC, and she had just got a diagnosis of FTD. We were doing a screening of Unraveled, and she came to it. I think it was like the night of her diagnosis meeting. And so they were like, well, let's just stay for the thing. Somebody brought her to it. And then I didn't know any of this until recently. She went out and bought paints and stuff and started to just paint. She just had her first gallery showing, and she said, I'm going to do this. I'm going to take this thing and see if that works. And it kind of has. This is sort of art imitating life and then life imitating art again. I kind of like the circle of that. Like, okay, I've done my job. Tick. And that feels kind of cool.
And in a way, it kind of mirrors back to your story. You know, you were inspired to create a work of art, and now it's kind of gone full circle. So there you
Pass
go.
it on. I get the idea that the capacity is there. And so I like the idea of the evidence of somebody using this. I like the idea of people using this for their own nefarious purposes. That feels good.
Well, Dr. Miller Bruce's story with Dr. Adams on Radiolab sparked a sense of hope for you, and now you have gone and sparked that hope in somebody else. So just keep on passing that hot potato.
A little bit.
I'm just immensely grateful to both of you in your own right and in this beautiful pairing. I think also just we could have a whole other conversation on just that juxtaposition and the really beautiful elements that you highlight in one another, that you bring out in one another, this relationship that the two of you have. Thank you for sharing your time with me and with our audience. Deeply, deeply grateful to you.
Back to you. We're the three of us really get great joy in working together, and thank you for this podcast very much.
Yeah. Thanks, Magda.
This episode of Dancing into Brain Health was edited and produced by me, Magda Kaczmarska, and Hillary Brown Estrefi. The music for this show is the title cut from the album Critical Path by Joe Venegoni and Carl Weingarten. Show notes, links, and resources from today's episode can be found on the Dancing into Brain Health page on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.